Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell, the podcast where I ask the people in comedy about comedy and what it means to them. I ask them to wax philosophical, for in the sitcom of existence, comedy is the blooper reel, where mistakes and misunderstandings are transformed into chuckles and that snorting noise you make, reminding us not to take life too seriously. I'm the comedy nerd who's seen more than 1,500 comedians perform live comedy, and you can find out more about my journey in comedy fandom on my website, thecomedynerd.com. If you like to hear what comedians have to say as much as I do, then please like, subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode is a writer, broadcaster, podcaster, filmmaker, and comedian who is a veteran of the fringe with multiple solo shows as well as membership of illustrious collaborations such as Consignia and the Alternative Comedy Memorial Society. His comedy can at times be dark and brooding, while at other times playful and silly. It's stand-up comedian Alexander Bennett. Let's start back at the beginning. How much was comedy an influence on you in the early days when you were growing up?
So sort of right back at the beginning. So I wanted to be a cartoonist for most of my childhood, and watched an awful lot of cartoons. We unusually had Nickelodeon.
Yep.
Which was like, there was some sort of, we had like the most basic Sky package that you could get. In your face, Sunak. But all that really gave us was there was a sport channel for my dad, and weirdly Nickelodeon was like bundled in.
Yeah.
So I got to watch a lot of. There was a period in the 90s where there were all these like 80s like acid casualties, like artists, and they just gave all these people children's cartoons for no other reason than this will probably be creative.
Yeah.
So that the like Nickelodeon 90s cartoons are incredibly creative, and I loved them. And then even younger, I would watch Tom and Jerry with my granddad, and love the golden era of Tom and Jerry, and it's so funny.
Yeah.
And a lot of sort of Tex Avery kind of, Warner Brothers era stuff. And then The Simpsons was on BBC Two when I got a bit older, and then The Simpsons is everything. And then I got a little bit older, and my dad introduced me to Ronnie Barker. Was the key. I kind of was reared on sitcoms that were sort of 20 years out of date by the time I was watching them.
Yeah.
And Blackadder, and especially when you're a teenage boy being shown Rick Mayall's stuff, that is exactly what you want. So, I had the same relationship with Rick Mayall that people probably, 20 years my senior have with him, because I was introduced at the right moment.
Yeah.
It's like, here you are, here it is. And it was in watching that stuff that I realized that the thing I loved about the cartoons wasn't necessarily that they were cartoons, it's that they were funny. And I think that's what made me realize, the thing I want to be is funny.
Yeah.
And that's where all those influences came from, and then that balloons into everything else, and you see stand up for the first time, and you get into that.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if this is going sort of too far forward at this stage, but I started doing stand up very young, and stand up's accessible in a way that nothing else is.
Yes.
I couldn't like, I'm from the Midlands. My parents had very, my dad was a line layer on building sites, and then he taught people how to operate heavy machinery. And my mother was a teaching assistant / ran a school's intranet. So they had very like working class jobs that they'd got a certain level of education to kind of top up.
Sure.
So they don't know anything about getting you into a drama school or something like that. But with stand-up, you can just ring a bloke and say, can I do 5?
Yeah.
And that bloke might say, yeah, go on then. You're the first 15-year-old I've had this conversation with, but yeah, sure. So yeah, I knew I wanted to make things and be funny, and then stand-up is the thing that's accessible to you.
Yeah. It's funny. It's I think Jamie Allerton said if you want to fulfill your dream, you've got to study, you've got to work hard, you've got to, you've got to do all the processes you have to go through. But if your dream is to do stand up, you can do it day one. You just you start. If you want to get good at it, that takes time and study and work, but you could do it straight away. So.
And you can only get good at it by doing it. You can, in terms of like presenting it to people, like you can become a good painter in isolation and no one ever sees it.
Yeah.
You can't do that with stand-up.
So then when you took your first tentative steps as a 15-year-old, what was that like? What was your first gig and how did it go for you?
My first gig was in Derby at the Blessington Carriage, which is still a gig, still run by the lovely Spiky Mike. I had the same experience a lot of stand-ups here have, which is the very first gig goes well. Because you've kind of got a lot of energy sort of pent up in you.
Yeah.
And because it's your first time on stage, people are kind of inherently on your side because they can sort of smell how nervous you are.
Yeah.
Although I wasn't as nervous as I should have been, because I'd done like school talent shows where I'd done like bits of stand-up. And because I'd been like performing to my peers, they had gone well. So I didn't really understand the idea of doing badly yet. Like I intellectually knew that was a thing that happened, that would happen. But when you've done like 3 gigs, you don't.
Yeah.
Like, and 2 of them are like softball gigs that you would have done well at.
Yeah.
So when the first gig in Derby went well, I was like, oh great. And I had, a lot of people, I had several other kind of newer acts who were like booking open spot gigs in the Midlands come up to me and go, can I book you for this? Which is what you want at those gigs. That's what those gigs are for.
Yeah.
And then I just died for the following year. just like relentless death. Just absolutely brutal, relentless death pretty much all the time.
So having started gigging, then was doing stand-up what you anticipated it would be?
I was too young to anticipate it being anything. You don't have enough life experience to sort of scope out what it's going to be. And also stand-up has changed a lot since I started doing it. So it was a different landscape. To make myself sound a hell of a lot older than I actually am. But it was. When I did my first gigs, it was just before McIntyre broke.
Right.
So if you think about what a different landscape it was at that period of time, the circuit was a very different place.
Yeah.
And then I was doing gigs, but at a distance. You're not like properly being a stand-up when you're a child and then you go to university. But I do remember sort of an older version of the circuit that operated slightly differently.
Yeah.
And then having to go through this sort of constant learning process of what it is now compared to what it was that I read about.
Right. What are the changes that you've seen specifically?
Well, there are some like really obvious changes, which is mainly women doing it.
Yeah.
Like just to be like incredibly brutal, when I started, the number of women doing stand-up was very small still. And now most gigs I do are knocking on for an even split, gender-wise. So that's like an obvious thing. The audiences have changed.
Yeah.
Audiences used to audiences of general gigs used to watch stuff with an attitude of this will be good, I'll see what it's like. And audiences now at just regular club gigs watch those gigs with an attitude of this better be good. And just how much the industry has changed in terms of how sort of corporate it's got, and the money coming in a big old way. The money was already in when I started, but it's changed completely.
Yeah. Well, what about yourself? Because you've been doing comedy for a fair old while now. How have you changed in terms of how you do comedy?
Well, I started wanting to be a character act, and the first Edinburgh shows I ever did were like character showcases, And then I had one character that I stuck at for a few years, who no one ever thought was a character, which is a bad sign. If you're interested, if you're on stage doing a character and people go, "That was a character," that's a worry. So I wanted to do that, and would have kind of like, some of those bits weren't unsuccessful. I had the sort of best character I had kind of wouldn't make sense anymore. He was like, he was just like a horrible newspaper editor, and the idea was that like Murdoch suddenly dies and his horrible like oiky son inherits everything. So it's like you've got the Murdoch Empire, but now this guy who's like 20 runs it. And he was quite a good character. And then there was one character I had in a show who was like a blind ex-policeman who was like it was a character I came up with in about 5 minutes and kind of worked the best in that thing I was making at the time. And then I had the character I did for several years, which was influenced by Al Murray's character, who is Al Murray's the pub landlord. I really like the idea of having a stage persona, but it's me presenting the pub landlord. So the character is called Your Beloved Alexander Bennett, in a sort of this is how you talk to the dictator kind of language. And he was sort of, the idea was it was like a stand-up. It was like a mad, pathetic stand-up crossed with like, it was sort of meant to be like a parody of stand-ups who tell people how they should live their lives.
Right, yeah.
And or I am the moral authority on everything. and it was trying to combine. So I used to come on stage and go, "Hail me," and the audience would have to hail me. And then I would sort of make decrees, and they were all like jokes, but it was like, here's how I would run the world. It's sort of like a parody of like what a stand-up is, telling people how they should do things and what's right and what's wrong, but trying to make it sort of as pathetic as possible to sort of highlight the madness of it. And I think it would have benefited a lot from just a lot of stand-up is actually just telling people what you're doing. And if I'd have made it clearer that that's what the intent was, people might have like latched onto it a bit more. But it was very annoying because it was the act was very schizophrenic. So the shows would constantly be like, "Oh, I'm just getting into this thing he's doing. Oh, he's doing something else that is like completely different and hasn't been linked at all to the other thing." And it kind of, I feel like it felt like a lot of stopping and starting to people. But I was trying to sort of create the meaning by putting things together. So you talk about montage in cinema. Because I did a film degree, and it was like, if you put these two things together, the fact that they're together creates a meaning, which is all very well and good, but you need to tell people that's what you're doing. Otherwise people go, "What is this? What is this?" And also, being live in front of people is not an edit. It's a different thing. So yeah, there were lots of sort of failed character ventures. And I was for some reason, I was very, very resistant to being myself on stage, and thought that I had to find a persona to use as a lens through which to project myself. And eventually came around to the conclusion that is not necessary, and there are more interesting things to do. I think persona is a very misunderstood thing in stand-up, and people simplify it. Ultimately, if you are sincerely talking about things that are meaningful to you as an individual, if you're doing it well, by definition, it will be unique to you. And that's all you need, really.
I like this idea that the person on stage is playing a version of themselves. If you're not playing a character, if you are you, but it's not you, it's a version of you. It's like a you times 10 or something like that. I mean, how much of you is you being honest on stage, honest inverted commas on stage, and how much of it is a projection of a part of you kind of thing?
I view it as dials. So it's like I dial that bit up to 10, I dial that bit down to 3. So it's all true.
Yeah.
It's just different bits are dialed up and dialed down. And you understand how audiences perceive you. It took me a long time for me to understand that audiences like it when I'm articulate. I'm very there's lots of comics I love. Phil Ellis would be a good example of this. Bridget Christie, Ali Bryce is great at this. People who can be inarticulate and it's really funny.
Yeah.
So like when Bridget Christie is in a rage and she's like kind of like frothing at the mouth, and she's not, obviously she is very articulate, but she can be funny and inarticulate.
Yeah.
And I love that, but it's not me and it's not what audiences want from me. So that's a dial I have to turn up to 10.
Yeah.
Is if I'm landing something, I really have to know what the thing is that I'm landing. And there's other ways in which I don't have to sort of have that level of control or whatever. In terms of, you know, I don't have to like really tightly script everything that I say on stage.
Yeah.
But understanding that audiences want you to be articulate and understanding, and this has taken me years to understand, and I think it takes you a long time when you start so young. Understanding that you've got quite a lot of authority in the room. And I have got quite a lot of authority now because I've been doing this for a long time. And if I want to command authority in front of an audience, I can do it. But that's taken me, like, you know, the entire time I've been doing stand-up to understand, really. So you dial that up. I don't feel like that in my life, but on stage, you dial it up because it's what connects with people.
Yeah. And like you say, you've been doing comedy for a while, so you've done Edinburgh many years and a number of shows. Do you have shows that you kind of look back on fondly, or is every time you're writing the new show, is the last show is now gone and put to bed, and you move on and it's always moving forward? How far do you refer back to things that you've done?
You try not to. You always feel like you're doing sort of something better than the thing that you've just done. That can be different. So the show I'm currently making is so different to the previous show as to be incomparable, really. So I can't really do that. There are shows I remember very fondly.
Yeah.
The main one being the game show we used to do, because it really looked like the first time we did it, it looked like it was not going to work, and it did work. So I remember that show extremely fondly. You're kind of always looking at the next thing, really.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, like years later, you can, I found some video the other day from a show from 2016.
Yeah.
And there's some all right jokes in it, which is a delight to discover, really.
Yeah. When you're writing, do you keep things in even if they don't necessarily play to audience? When you recognize a good joke, you think it's good, but it doesn't necessarily land. Do you kind of keep things in for your own amusement?
So there's you'd consider a few different factors in doing that. How far out of the sort of track of the show am I walking to get this thing in?
Yeah.
Is the reaction neutral or actively hostile? You weigh a few things up.
Yeah.
I tend not to, really.
Yeah.
I don't keep stuff in shows if it's just for me.
Yeah.
I used to, I don't anymore. Yeah, I basically consider it a bit of a waste of time now.
Yeah.
But there will be it's less jokes, it's more like references to things.
Right.
Which you can do very subtly, and then one person will go, "Is that a thing?" And you go, "Yeah." That's satisfying.
Yeah.
Because it interrupts nothing. It's not, no one who doesn't want to see it sees it, and then one person will go, "Oh, that's like a little thing for me."
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of nice end of doing that.
Yeah.
There's without spoiling anything, there is a reference to a very specific thing in the show I'm making at the moment.
Yeah.
and it's not a huge percentage of an audience that gets the reference ahead of sort of what it is being revealed.
Yeah.
But those who do are immensely satisfied.
Yes. I do like it when occasionally there is something that I pick up on, and that maybe the general consensus around the room is that no joke has passed, and yet you kind of notice it and you think, oh, I've got an extra bonus joke for myself.
Yeah, that's the perfect version of it, I think. Is it like it interrupts nothing for the audience as a whole,
Yeah.
but for those who seek to find, it's a lovely little treat.
Yeah. What about watching comedy? Are you still a fan of comedy as an entertainment? Do you go out and watch it, when you can?
When I can, which is not nearly as often as I would like, I am working constantly, so it is rare that I get to go out and see stuff. But I have always been a student of the art, and I always will be, and I am rarely happier than when I've gone to see something that I think is just brilliant. I've made a promise to myself this year in Edinburgh. I'm actually going to go and watch some fucking shows, because that would make me a lot happier in Edinburgh. Because Edinburgh's hard work. It's stressful. There's a lot at stake.
Yeah.
And there's a small part of you going, don't go and see something, because if it's really good, you'll think that you're shit and you'll hate yourself and your show. But that's actually not what happens. What happens is that, you go and see somebody who's doing something totally different to you that you wouldn't do.
Yeah.
But if it's done really well, then it's, it kind of lifts you. It's like, oh, I feel good about being on a festival that this is also on at.
Yeah.
That's why this, that's why the Edinburgh Fringe is special. But yeah, I do generally, when I go and watch someone live outside of the Fringe, it's either because I'm on the same gig as them, which is how I see most live comedy.
Yeah.
And I do stick around and watch stuff. And it'll be American acts who aren't here very often.
Yes.
So I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but I saw Mark Maron at the Bloomsbury Theatre. Fantastic. But he's here once every few years, so I went to see that. Yeah.
And do you still watch it like the young you would have watched it, or do you watch it as the comedian, with the comedian's eye?
Yeah, I watched it as a comedian.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between me thinking that something is good and me kind of actively enjoying something. To be honest, because I can get to punchlines quicker than most people.
Yeah.
So I can watch an hour of stand-up and go, that's very good. You've got an A in my assessment of you. Yeah. But I haven't laughed much because I got to all the punchlines first.
Yeah.
So the stuff that really makes me laugh is stuff where I can't get to the punchlines first. Which is why live comedy is so good, because you're in the room, you are never as quick as the person on stage. And like mentally quick, like they are making connections faster than you can make them. Yeah. And stuff that's just very like, it has to be like really personal or really weird.
Yeah.
Because then I can't get to the punchline first.
Yeah.
So yeah, most of the sort of comedy I like is either very personal or very weird, because that's the thing that stops me, getting jokes I can predict.
Yeah.
But somebody really telling me something about themselves, I can't predict.
Yeah.
And by telling me something about themselves, I don't mean my mother's from Albuquerque and I am half Canadian, and I don't give a shit about any of that. I care about how you feel.
Yeah. Yeah. Similarly, when you're directing, as you did with Sean Duxey's Great Show, it must be interesting and unusual in that scenario, because you're guiding, advising a show, but it's someone else's comedy, it's someone else's story.
Yeah.
And it's the way they would do comedy.
Yeah.
But obviously, it might not be the way that you do comedy. So you kind of have to change the mindset again.
Yeah, I found it really enjoyable. It's really nice to work on something and remove yourself from, like it's for someone else. You're making a thing, and it's been very freeing to do kind of. I directed Shan's show, and I've done a couple of other directing things for other people, and we'll be doing it again in the future.
Yes.
Yeah, you've got to. It's about helping someone articulate the thing they're trying to articulate. So you don't. You only push them in the directions that they've told you they want to be pushed in.
Right.
I think directing kind of isn't quite the right word for what it is. I think coaching is probably a better word.
Yeah.
But then there's skill sets that I have that are useful. So I'm very the thing I'm good at in writing an hour is structure. Structure kind of is the easiest thing to me. It comes very naturally. So some people I've worked with, that's the thing that is the most difficult thing for them. So I'm a good director for that person because let's take your qualities and have my qualities. And if you tell me what it is you're trying to articulate, together we can sort of pull out the structure from the material and go, okay, this is how it all flow and go together. But it's about, it has to come from them. I would never sit down with someone and go, okay, your show ending needs to be this. What I will do is sit down with them for hours and ask them, what is it that you want to say? And then when I get that out of them, go, okay, if that's what you want to say, then you need to convey that in such a way that these things get across. It's about sort of pulling something out of someone rather than imposing something on someone. And I've found it very, very satisfying, and I was delighted with how well Shan's show went down. And also, Shan's show specifically, Shan is a completely different comedian to me, and the audience that show reaches is a completely different audience to the one that is necessarily going to come and see my show. I think they would like my show, but they're not going to come and see it. So it's really satisfying to work in that kind of space, to have creative input in something that is very different to you.
Do you find yourself in different times favouring doing your solo work or favouring doing collaboration? Because if you do things with weirdos or ACMS or directing, do you find that the comedian that is you that collaborates is a different comedian to you when you're doing something solo?
So it all depends on the individual sort of projects, really. So my solo stuff is, entirely created by me. Although this most recent solo show, I've had several collaborators coming in. The game show I do, Hell to Play, was collaborative, and it was written by several people and performed with several people, chief among which is Paul Savage, who was with me from the start of the project. But I am the head of that. It's my thing. And, I say yes and no to stuff. Born Yesterday, my podcast with Andy Barr. It's me and Andy. And, me and Andy are sort of equal partners in that. But I invented it. So, there's collaborative things that you're kind of in control of. And then there's directing someone, which is you are very much not in control. They are absolutely in control. But it's part of your job to push them on certain things. And then with stuff like ACMS and weirdos, I'm very much being invited, and consignia and stuff like that. And I think there's a real joy in that stuff, because being asked to do something is great, and there's a lot of freedom in being asked to do something. I think people actually kind of perform quite well when they're invited to be part of something else. Because there's a lot of freedom in it. If someone says to you, "Hey, come down," and with consignia, Phil Jarvis would always say to me, "I've got a sort of vague idea of what I want you to do," and I would say, "Yeah, how about I do it like this?" And he'd go, "Yeah, do it like that." That's very freeing. So every thing that you do has a sort of different route into it that you're doing, and you know, I think keeping things interesting is keeping things different, really.
As someone who does writing and radio and writing your own shows and performing, do you have a like a comfort zone where you're happiest?
I think having made a full show and performing it and it's going well,
Yeah,
I think you've got your own hour, you're doing something that you care about and it's going down well.
yeah,
Uh, that's pretty great, really. And you're not. It's a weird feeling when you're kind of relaxed and not relaxed. You're um, you're not relaxed because you're on stage performing to people, but in another sense, you are relaxed because you're all enjoying this, and I've got a lot more stuff that is better coming your way.
yeah.
So, yeah, when a solo show is really on its feet, and you work out very quickly that the audience that is watching it is enjoying it, then yeah, that's a great place to be.
Yeah.
Because then you can get playful. The best space to be in the stage is knowing something back to front, an audience is enjoying it, and then you start fucking around with it because they trust you enough to take it in different directions and be silly and improvise, and that's probably when you're at your best as a comedian, is when you really know what you're doing. It's going down very well, so you then use the material as a solid springboard to whatever else it is that occurs to you in the moment, and that's when you write like new stuff, like at the end of a cycle of a show, suddenly coming up with 2 minutes of stuff going, why wasn't in this from the start? It was because you weren't that relaxed up to this point, so you couldn't come up with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the happiest place, I think, for me.
Yeah. Well, on that, and we've touched on Edinburgh a little bit, which we'll talk more about. But obviously, if you're preparing a show and you're like testing it in works in progress, obviously that show will change and mature up until you get to the Fringe. But how much does the show change from day one of the Fringe to the end of the run, if at all?
Going by my previous Edinburghs, it does change. The change is mainly cutting things out, is what I find, and the odd sort of writing a sort of neater link from one idea to another. Right. I will do that, but generally in Edinburgh, I'm cutting stuff, and I also know I'm in a good position if I'm cutting stuff.
Yeah.
Because if you're in Edinburgh and you're like, I need to write another 5 minutes, that's bad. And I'm not, and I have, I have written the odd new bit in Edinburgh. I feel like, to be very sort of industry about it, I would have more time to work on the shows in Edinburgh if I didn't self-produce everything. And I know, Darren Harriott, great comedian, he does his show, records it, and then goes back to his flat and works on it every single day of the Fringe. So it means that by the end of the run, it's a very, very tight hour of stand-up, which is great, and I sort of envy that. And I know that, Phil Ellis turns up on day one with a sort of rough idea of what the show is, and by the end of the first week, it's getting nominated for the for the main awards. I would, if I had more support, I would have more time to work on the shows while I was up there.
Yeah.
So what I try to do is make sure I'm in a position where I've got a show that I really like, so I can do little tweaks. I mean, they're definitely better by the end of the run than they are by the start of the run. That's absolutely true. But for me, I think that's largely cutting things out. Never be afraid to just rip jokes out of the show, because you'd be surprised how much you can improve a piece of comedy by taking some of the jokes out.
So on the subject of Edinburgh then, how do you feel about the festival as a whole? Not just your show and obviously the shows that you hopefully will be able to go and see, but the social aspect, the industry aspects?
Well, Edinburgh is two things at the same time. One of them is, and I missed this, and I'd forgotten how much I missed it, until I got there, until I did a full run last year, is Edinburgh is the most creative place you will ever go, and it is full of people working at the top of their game to put their hearts and souls on the line to create something that means something to an audience, an experience or a feeling that they can carry with them out of the room, or just makes them fucking piss laughing for an hour.
Yeah.
And all of these things are the absolute best. And the collaboration that happens in Edinburgh, where you get to do different things with different people.
Yeah.
So I love Edinburgh for that. And Edinburgh is a massive industry shop window, and is ungodly expensive. I can only afford to do Edinburgh because I've been the recipient of grants, and I have no dependents, so it's fine if my bank account goes into the black. There's no real consequences for anyone apart from me. I have no savings because I spend it going to Edinburgh every year. So there is no safety net for me as a person. I have a family. There are people in significantly more precarious positions than me. There are many people who can't afford to go to Edinburgh this year, and I can.
Yeah.
But by obliterate myself financially again. So all that needs to change, because a huge amount of money is made at that festival. So why are the people making the things at the festival so broke? So, Edinburgh is those two things.
Yeah. Well, previous shows that you've done from Edinburgh, anyone listening can get to see your shows Terrifying Smile and Housewife's Favourite on Next Up.
Yes.
And you've got They Call Me Daddy Punchlines is on YouTube.
It certainly is.
But they are not this year's Edinburgh show. So what's that all about, and what can people expect when they come and see
you? So this year's Edinburgh show, Alexander Bennett, Emotional Daredevil, 6:20 at the Gilded Balloon Hatter House, every day of the Fringe, is it's a show about risk and the necessity of risk in building relationships. It's a stylistically very different show from anything that I've done as a solo show before. There is a certain amount of audience participation. I'm doing something on stage that I haven't done in a show for a very long time. And I'll leave it at that, shall I? There's a certain element of mystery to the main mechanism of the show that I'm trying to maintain in the promotion of. Yeah. So I've sort of said as much as I probably can there.
Sure. Do you set yourself objectives? Do you have objectives for this show, what you might hope to achieve with it, either with an audience or for if you wanted to get a particular review or a particular opportunity? Or do you have targets for yourself, like that you might want to play certain venues or work with certain people? Do you have those kinds of objectives?
Yes, absolutely. And the sort of, the industry/career objectives are very different to the sort of creative objectives. And I do have those industry/career objectives. An example was I played the Soho Theatre for the first time recently, with my last show, which was lovely. I would like to play it again for longer with more people in the room. So that's a very obvious route one, but you have those aims.
Sure.
And the creative aims are much more. They're more personal, and they're more. You'll have to come and see the show to work out what those are.
And you mentioned also your excellent podcast, Born Yesterday with Andy Barr. In the spirit of the podcast, you have 2 minutes in which to explain what that's all about.
Born Yesterday is a podcast in which Andy Barr and I play clones of ourselves, and those clones have had 24 hours to learn about 3 things. And then we ask comedian guests to explain other things to the clones, bearing in mind that the clones only understand 3 things. So they have to do that to a time limit while the clones ask irritating questions. And it's one of those games which I don't know if you necessarily get when it's described to you, but the moment you start listening to it, you understand what it is as a thing.
Yeah.
And we've had, brilliant guests. Phil Wang, Jordan Gray, Anya Magliano, Pierre Novelli, Ahia Shah. We did one recently with Amy Matthews and Shalaka Karup that was really good fun.
Yeah.
Most recent one with Milo Edwards and Charlie V. Martin was a really good time. There's a back catalogue of some absolute nonsense for people to get stuck into if they want.
Yeah. I love it. It's absolutely hilarious, and you can hear the joy that's going on as you're recording, and that is what absolutely makes comedy for me. The people who are performing it are having a great time doing it.
Yeah, the thing that kind of, we know that we're onto something with Born Yesterday, because after almost every recording, at least one of the comedians on it goes, "This is really good," because most podcasts made by comedians are, "What's your perfect Sunday roast? Would you have cauliflower cheese?" And forgive me for sticking my neck out and saying that we should be more creative. So yeah. Seeing as we're in plugging stuff,
Sure.
this isn't a proper plug yet, but in referring to shows, at some point the filmed version of my most recent show, I Can't Stand the Man Myself, will be released. I can't specify where it will be released yet, but that is forthcoming, so keep an eye out.
Excellent. So, given the wealth of experience and all the people that you've worked with, and all these different types of shows, as well as all your own shows, what so far have been the best and worst experiences in comedy that you've had, whether that be a gig or something else?
I think some of the best experiences are, it's interesting sometimes where you can have a whole room of people give you a massive round of applause. And that's kind of part of the course. And then you chat to someone individually and they say that either they found you extremely funny or that you were doing something that really connected with them. And that stays in the mind a lot more than a room full of people. Because it's not anonymized anymore, it's personal. So that's a great thing. There was the Edinburgh that we did at the game show for the first time, where we had an original cast who were all brilliant comedians, and we'd very poorly articulated to them how the show was going to work. Because the show, if misunderstood, was very offensive, they all just dropped out. So we had to find a new cast with very little notice. So that was a real low point. And then the show working, oh my God, not only does this work, it works really well. That's a real high point. I love that game show. It needs financing to do again. Highlights, really good, like ACMS bills where I'm guest hosting with Tom Tuck and just dicking around with just incredibly talented people in the room. Doing solo shows. I had the 2018 show Housewives Favorite is really personal and about kind of the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And the last run of that Fringe, I got applauded out of the venue. So I did the show, got a round of applause. And it was so you're always a bit emotionally exhausted at the end of a run anyway.
Yeah.
And it was at the Waverley Bar on the Free Fringe, which is a tiny pub. So did the show, did the bucket, got my shit out of the way, and then came down the stairs of the venue, and then half the pub applauded me out of the venue because they'd connected with the show that much. So I went and had a little cry. So that stays with me. I don't know if that's happy. That's not best or worst. That's just that's impactful, is what that is.
Do you think that there's one key lesson that you've learned so far? One thing that sticks in your mind and sort of informs your philosophy?
Sort of, there's different levels that you can read that. One's a very practical level. How do I do this as a job and as a profession?
Yeah.
And the thing I've learned about that is ask for help. Because I never thought I was deserving of help, and I didn't know. And you have to learn that. There's an awful lot of very middle class people in comedy, and despite the fact I sound like I absolutely am one of them, I absolutely am not. And there is a language that they speak that I don't. And I've spoken to other acts who are of a similar class background to me who also don't speak that language. And that language it's like a social language. It's a knowing how to talk to this group of people so that we might work together in the future. And, oh, yeah, you can help us with that. And even the act of asking like a business to consider you as a prospect is just, I was raised to think no one cares about what you're trying to do. You need to do it all yourself. So learning to ask for help is a really important thing on the practical industry side of it.
Yeah.
And if you don't speak the same language as other people, you can try and learn that language. And in terms of, and I kind of always knew this, but I think it's been proved. It's the one thing I would say to people that is useful, which is if you don't like what you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And you always know, we talked about cutting jokes earlier. I've had jokes in shows that work that I've cut out because I don't like them. And if you're stood on stage doing stuff that you don't like, you're going to start hating yourself and the show very quickly.
Yeah.
So you've got to, you particularly in the context of Edinburgh, like Edinburgh can be really hard. You can have a rough time. You can get bad reviews. You can get hard audiences. If you believe in what you're doing, even if you're so wrong, but if you believe in what you're doing, then you can kind of weather anything, really.
Yeah. And like I said before, one of the things I absolutely love is when I see a performer who clearly is enjoying what they're doing, and it makes all the difference in the world.
It does. It makes all the difference. And knowing that it was sort of just before the pandemic or post-pandemic, I realized that so much about being funny is about being relaxed. And that is very connected to watching someone enjoying what they're doing.
Yes.
And I unlocked, and it was through doing just so many like mainstream Friday, Saturday night gigs in central London.
Yeah.
And eventually I got to a stage where I could walk on and compare them and not do a single joke for the whole show and have them laughing. And it's like, oh, I'm funny because I'm relaxed.
Yeah.
Is really the reason I'm funny is because I'm relaxed. And it doesn't mean that the thing that like my persona is he's a relaxed guy, because that's very much not who I am. And it's not who I am on stage either. But because you are just able to enjoy being on stage, people latch onto that. People latch onto the show I'm working on at the moment. One of the reasons in which there is a good deal of audience interaction in it is because I am very relaxed doing that, and it relaxes me. It's a lot of people would be scared about having audience interaction in a show. It feels very safe to me. So I like that is an element of what I'm doing, because having a chat to someone and then they say something and I improvise a joke on the spot, that's an audience knowing that you're enjoying what you're doing in that moment. Because why would you bother? If you weren't enjoying it, why would you bother making something up on the spot to make someone laugh?
Yeah. Alex, how can we find out about you and where we can come and see you perform?
Follow me on Instagram at Alexander E. Bennett. That's Alexander, the letter Y, Bennett. AlexanderBennettComedian.com. I am on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. And you can sign up to my mailing list on my website as well. So feel free to do it.
And so my last question then, the question I ask all of my guests, how would you sum up comedy in a nutshell?
It's a fine way to waste a life.
Yeah, let's end on a real positive message.
Is that the sort of thing you were looking for?
I think it was, but I didn't know it until now.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you.